The autumn winds howled across the Dakota plains as smoke still rose from the charred remains of Sarah Mitchell's farmhouse. 3 terrified children huddled behind her as she faced the town council in the Clearwater church, their faces a wall of cold indifference. Mayor Wallace Thornton delivered the verdict with clinical detachment. The town's resources are stretched thin. We cannot rebuild your farm. You should return to your family back east. What the citizens of Clearwater didn't know was that before becoming a farmer's wife and mother, Sarah Mitchell had been Captain Sarah Holloway, decorated Army nurse who'd served alongside General Sherman during the bloodiest campaigns of the Civil War, saving countless lives in field hospitals where most would have perished, and developing survival skills that rivaled the most seasoned frontiersmen. As the council dismissed her plea for help, Sarah's mind was already calculating distances to the Comanche territories and cataloguing the wilderness skills that would keep her children alive during the journey ahead. Some decisions look like defeat to others, but serve as strategic retreats to those who understand survival. The town of Clearwater was about to learn that abandoning Sarah Mitchell would be the mistake they'd regret for generations to come. The old church bell tolled 4 times as Sarah and her children, Emma, age 10, James, 8, and little Rebecca, barely 6, walked slowly back to the ruins of what had once been their home. The early October sky threatened snow, unusual for this time of year, but weather patterns had been unpredictable since summer. Sarah's mind processed this fact automatically, adjusting her mental inventory of supplies and timeline for travel. "What will we do now, Mama?" Emma asked, her small hand gripping Sarah's skirt. Though young, Emma already carried herself with the quiet determination she'd inherited from her mother. "We'll do what we must," Sarah answered, her voice steady despite the calculations running through her mind. "We'll survive." 3 days had passed since the fire that had consumed their home and claimed her husband Thomas's life. While the townspeople had helped extinguish the blaze, their charity had quickly evaporated when rumors spread that Thomas had been behind on loan payments to the bank. With the railroad survey crews moving through the territory, land suddenly had new value, and a widow's claim, without a man to work, it was seen as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. As they approached the burned homestead, Sarah noted how Sheriff Benton and 2 men from the bank were already measuring the property line near what remained of the barn. Their presence was no coincidence. Vultures rarely waited for the body to cool. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sheriff Benton called, touching his hat with feigned respect. "Sorry to hear about the council's decision. Tough times for everyone." Sarah nodded, curtly but said nothing, her experienced eyes taking inventory of what little remained untouched by the flames. The root cellar had survived, its heavy doors blackened but intact. The small tool shed at the edge of the property still stood, overlooked by the fire that had been suspiciously concentrated around the main house and barn. "Banks willing to offer $30 for the remaining acreage," one of the men volunteered, not bothering to introduce himself. "Considering the circumstances, that's quite generous. The land was worth 10 times that amount, especially with the railroad coming." Sarah recognized the tactic. She'd seen similar predatory behavior in the aftermath of battles when civilians returned to find their homes destroyed. "We're not selling," she replied evenly, guiding her children toward the root cellar. "Please leave my property." The men exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for her refusal. Most widows in her situation would have gratefully accepted any offer, however insulting. "Now, Mrs. Mitchell," the sheriff began, his tone condescending, "be reasonable. How do you plan to survive winter with 3 little ones and no shelter?" "No man to work the land," Sarah turned, meeting his gaze directly. Something in her eyes, a hardness cultivated in field hospitals where she'd made life and death decisions under artillery fire, caused the sheriff to take an involuntary step backward. "I said we're not selling. The claim is in my name as well as my husband's. Good day, gentlemen." As the men reluctantly departed, Sarah led her children to the root cellar, unlocking the heavy doors with the key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside, shelves lined with preserved foods, seeds, and basic medical supplies represented 6 months of careful preparation. Thomas had always teased her about her insistence on maintaining emergency provisions, calling it her army habits. Now those habits would save their lives. Emma, inventory the preserves. James, help me with the canvas sheets in the corner. Rebecca, count the candles and matches. The children moved with practiced efficiency, accustomed to their mother's methodical approach to household management. What they didn't fully understand was that Sarah's organizational systems weren't typical domestic arrangements, but adapted military logistics designed to maximize resources and minimize vulnerability. As James helped her unfold the heavy canvas, sheets, waterproofed using a technique she'd learned from an old trapper during the war, Sarah's mind mapped out their next moves. They would need shelter immediately, transportation within 3 days, and to be across the river before the first heavy snow, which her assessment of the cloud pattern suggested was less than 2 weeks away. From a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard, Sarah retrieved a small wooden box she hadn't opened since settling in Clearwater 4 years ago. Inside lay her official discharge papers from the Army Medical Corps, a rare commendation signed by General Sherman himself, and a small leather pouch containing gold coins, emergency funds she'd maintained through years of tight budgets. Most significantly, the box contained a carefully preserved map of the territories, with annotations about water sources, terrain challenges, and tribal boundaries. The notations were in a specialized shorthand she'd developed during the war for medical supply logistics, indecipherable to others, but clear as day to her trained eye. "Mama, we have 38 jars of preserves," Emma reported, her small voice carrying the serious tone of a subordinate, delivering an inventory report. 22 vegetables, 11 fruits, and 5 meat. "Good work," Sarah nodded, noting the numbers in a small journal she kept in her apron pocket. "James, 2 large canvas sheets, 1 smaller. The tools are all here: hammer, saw, axe, and Pa's hunting knife." Sarah felt a momentary tightness in her throat at the mention of Thomas's prized knife, a wedding gift from her father. She pushed the emotion aside, focusing on the practical. Sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. Night fell quickly in October, and with it came the first scattered snowflakes, melting as they hit the ground, but serving as a warning of what approached. Using techniques she'd learned creating field hospitals in hostile territory, Sarah transformed the root cellar into a temporary shelter. The space was cramped but defensible, with clear sightlines to the property approach and multiple exit options. Considerations that came automatically to her after years of setting up medical stations under threat of enemy attack. As the children huddled under wool blankets, Sarah maintained watch from the partially open cellar door, Thomas's old revolver loaded and within reach. The weapon felt familiar in her hands. During the war, medical personnel had often needed to defend their patients when battle lines shifted unexpectedly. Through the darkness, she detected movement at the edge of the property. 3 riders, moving with the deliberate caution of men attempting to remain undetected. Sarah recognized Sheriff Benton's distinctive silhouette among them. "Probably just checking to see if we've left," she whispered to herself, though her instincts suggested otherwise. The pattern of movement, approaching from multiple angles using available cover, suggested a more coordinated purpose than casual observation. Sarah slipped back into the cellar, closing the heavy doors silently and securing them with the interior bar. She moved her children to the rear of the space, behind the sturdy shelving units she'd positioned as potential barriers. "We're playing the quiet game," she whispered, a phrase she'd used during their time near the front lines when artillery fire came too close to the medical tents. The children immediately fell silent, even little Rebecca understanding the seriousness in her mother's tone. Above them, footsteps moved across the property, not the casual steps of curious observers, but the methodical movement of men searching for something. Sarah heard the distinct sound of metal striking wood as someone tested the integrity of the tool shed door. "Nothing worth taking," a voice muttered. "Check the cellar." Sarah's hand moved to the revolver as heavy boots approached the cellar doors. The exterior padlock rattled. "Locked from inside," another voice reported. "You think they're in there?" "Where else would they go?" Sheriff Benton's voice was unmistakable. "No one in town would take them in after the council's decision." "We could smoke 'em out," suggested the third man, his tone carrying an eagerness that sent a chill through Sarah's spine. "Don't be stupid," Benton snapped. "Bank wants this to look proper. We just need to convince her to sign the transfer papers. No sense making trouble. Widow with 3 kids in winter with no home. She'll sign by the end of the week if we just wait her out." The men's conversation drifted as they moved away from the cellar, discussing plans to return the following day. With papers from the bank, Sarah remained motionless until their horses' hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did she release a measured breath, her mind already processing this new information and adjusting her timeline. They couldn't wait until morning now. The men would return and their patience would be limited. "Change of plans," she whispered to her children. "We're leaving tonight." Emma's eyes widened. "But where will we go, Mama?" Sarah hesitated only briefly. The decision had been forming in her mind since the council's rejection, but she'd hoped for more preparation time. Now, necessity dictated immediate action. "West," she answered simply. "To find help from people who understand survival better than this town ever did." From her years tending wounded scouts and cavalry during the war, Sarah had developed an unusual respect for the indigenous tribes that most settlers feared. While military doctors dismissed traditional healing methods, she had quietly observed and documented their effectiveness, sometimes incorporating these techniques when conventional treatments failed. Most significantly, during a bloody skirmish along the Kansas border, Sarah had saved the life of a wounded Comanche warrior brought to her field hospital by mistake. Against orders, she had treated him with the same care given to Union soldiers, later helping him escape rather than face imprisonment. The warrior, who identified himself as Black Hawk, had promised that a debt existed between them, one that would be remembered if she ever needed assistance. As she prepared her children and gathered essential supplies, Sarah calculated the distance to the last known location of Black Hawk's band. The journey would be dangerous, crossing territory contested by multiple tribes and the U.S. cavalry, but less dangerous than remaining at the mercy of men like Sheriff Benton and the bank representatives whose intentions were transparently predatory. By midnight, Sarah had their most critical supplies bundled into packs sized appropriately for each child's capacity. Emma, the strongest, carried preserved food and medical supplies. James was responsible for tools and fire-starting materials. Even Rebecca had a small pack containing extra socks and lightweight but critical items. Sarah herself carried the heaviest load, including ammunition for the revolver, Thomas's hunting knife, and the small box of gold coins securely wrapped and hidden within her clothing. Around her neck, on the same chain as the cellar key, hung a distinctive bone amulet given to her by Black Hawk, a token he promised would identify her to any Comanche they might encounter. "Remember our walking game?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave the relative safety of the cellar. During their journey west from Pennsylvania years earlier, she had taught the children to walk long distances by turning it into a structured activity with rules and rewards. The children nodded, the familiar reference providing comfort amid the frightening uncertainty of their midnight departure. "Same rules apply," Sarah continued, keeping her voice steady and reassuring. Step exactly where I step. If I stop, you stop. If I signal silence, not a whisper. And what's the most important rule? Trust, Mama. They responded in unison, the words both a game response and a serious commitment. Using a small lantern heavily shielded to prevent its light from being visible at a distance, Sarah guided her children from the property, using a route that avoided the main road. Her knowledge of terrain assessment, developed during hasty relocations of field hospitals, allowed her to identify paths that combined concealment with manageable topography for small children. The first snowflakes continued to fall intermittently as they moved westward through the darkness. Though the ground cover hadn't begun to accumulate, Sarah recognized the weather pattern developing. Within 3 days, perhaps 4, the first significant storm of the season would arrive. By then, they needed to be well away from Clearwater and making substantial progress toward Comanche territory. As dawn approached, Sarah located a small ravine that offered both shelter from the wind and concealment from any pursuers. Using the canvas sheets and techniques developed for creating emergency medical stations, she constructed a temporary shelter nearly invisible from more than 20 feet away. "We'll rest during daylight and travel at night for now," she explained to the tired children as she distributed carefully measured portions of jerky and dried apple. "Just like the night rounds at the hospital camp. Remember?" Emma and James nodded, having heard stories of their mother's war service. Rebecca, too young to understand the reference, simply mimicked her older siblings. As the children drifted into exhausted sleep, Sarah maintained watch, calculating their progress against the map she'd memorized years earlier. They had covered approximately 7 miles, a remarkable distance for children in darkness, but far less than she had hoped. At this rate, reaching Comanche territory before the heavy snows would be challenging. She would need to acquire a horse, perhaps 2, to improve their speed. The thought brought her to her next immediate concern. Sheriff Benton and his men would discover their absence by morning. Based on her assessment of his character and motivations, pursuit was likely. Not out of concern for their welfare, but to protect the bank's interest in acquiring the property without complications. Sarah checked the revolver again, confirming its readiness while hoping its use wouldn't become necessary. Violence had never been her preference. As a nurse, she had dedicated herself to healing even the most grievously wounded. But her experiences had also taught her that survival sometimes required difficult choices, particularly when protecting those under her care. As the sun rose fully, Sarah settled into the vigilant half-sleep she had perfected during long nights. In field hospitals, resting enough to maintain function while remaining sufficiently alert to respond to any change in their environment. Her children's steady breathing provided both comfort and purpose. They would survive this journey. She would ensure it using every skill and resource at her disposal. What the townspeople of Clearwater had failed to understand when they so casually abandoned Sarah Mitchell and her children was that they weren't turning away a helpless widow, but a woman whose experiences had forged exceptional capabilities, a woman who had navigated far worse circumstances than those created by their callous indifference. And in the coming days, as they pursued their own petty interests, they would discover the significant miscalculation they had made in underestimating her resourcefulness, determination, and capacity for strategic thinking when protecting those she loved. The midday sun filtered weakly through grey clouds as Sarah maintained her vigilant watch, the revolver close at hand. Years of experience had taught her to distinguish between the natural sounds of the prairie and those made by humans, a skill that had saved countless lives when Confederate patrols approached too near her field hospitals. Now that same heightened awareness detected the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, still miles away but approaching steadily. "Emma," she whispered, gently waking her eldest. "I need you to watch your brother and sister. Stay absolutely silent, no matter what." The girl nodded solemnly, instantly alert in the way children of war learn to be. Sarah checked that James and Rebecca remained asleep before slipping out of their concealed shelter to better assess the approaching riders. Using a small, polished tin mirror from her medical kit, once used to redirect light during delicate surgical procedures, Sarah caught a reflection of 3 riders following their trail with methodical precision. Sheriff Benton led the group, flanked by the same men who had been measuring her property the previous day. Their posture and pace suggested determination rather than casual pursuit. Sarah's mind calculated options with clinical efficiency. Direct confrontation was inadvisable. 3 armed men against a single woman, regardless of her skills, presented poor odds, especially with children to protect. Evasion was the superior strategy, but required immediate action. Returning to the shelter, she quickly roused all 3 children, her movements efficient but gentle. "Remember our game of fox and hounds?" she asked, as she helped Rebecca into her small coat. The children nodded. It was another of their games that was actually a survival drill Sarah had devised during their journey west from Pennsylvania. The rules were simple. Move without leaving tracks, use natural features to break trail signs, and create false indicators to confuse pursuers. "We're going to play the advanced version," Sarah explained, already packing their minimal belongings. "James, what's the first rule of breaking a trail?" The boy straightened proudly at being asked. "Never go in a straight line, and use hard ground whenever possible." "Excellent. And Emma, how do we cross water?" "Step on stones, not mud, and move downstream when possible to wash away scent and footprints," the girl answered confidently. Sarah nodded approvingly as she distributed their packs, carefully adjusted to each child's carrying capacity. "Today, we add a new rule, separation and reunion. We'll divide briefly to create multiple trails, then meet at a designated point. This confuses the hounds and protects the foxes." The concern in Emma's eyes showed she understood this wasn't just a game, but she nodded bravely. Sarah had raised her children to face reality without unnecessary sheltering, a philosophy born from treating young soldiers who had never been prepared for the harsh truths of the world before facing battle. With practiced efficiency, Sarah guided her children from the ravine, using a route that kept them concealed behind a ridgeline. Once clear, she implemented her trail confusion strategy, a technique she'd learned from a Cherokee scout who had served as a guide for medical supply transports during the Atlanta campaign. First, she had the family walk single file across an exposed patch of ground, deliberately leaving clear tracks, heading north. After 100 yards, she directed them onto a rocky outcropping where their footprints wouldn't register. From this position, they doubled back using an entirely different path that eventually turned westward, their true direction of travel. "Emma, take James and Rebecca along this stream bed," Sarah instructed when they reached a small creek. "Follow it south for exactly 200 paces, then west until you reach the lightning-struck oak we saw from the ridge. Wait for me there, hidden just as we practiced." "Where will you be, Mama?" James asked, his young face serious beneath his woolen cap. "Creating a false trail to keep the game interesting," Sarah replied, deliberately keeping her tone light despite the gravity of their situation. "Remember, this is the advanced version, much more challenging." With a final embrace, Sarah watched her children pick their way carefully along the stream bed, Emma naturally taking the lead while ensuring Rebecca kept pace. Pride mingled with concern as they disappeared around a bend. Emma, at only 10 already, demonstrated the leadership qualities Sarah had seen in the finest nurses under her supervision. Once alone, Sarah moved quickly to implement the next phase of her evasion strategy. Taking a different direction entirely, she hiked rapidly northeast, leaving clear, deliberate tracks in softer ground, the opposite direction from her children's, Porth and their ultimate destination. After a quarter-mile, she removed one of Thomas's old work shirts she'd brought specifically for this purpose. Using the hunting knife, she tore several strips from the fabric, leaving them caught on bushes and tree branches along her false trail. Near a small pond, she disturbed the mud at the edge, as though someone had knelt to drink or fill a container. Then came the most crucial element of her deception. From her medical kit, Sarah removed a small vial of tincture of iodine, a powerful antiseptic she had used to treat countless wounds. In diluted form, it served as an essential medical supply, but in its concentrated state, it could stain skin and clothing with a reddish-brown color, remarkably similar to dried blood. Using precise amounts, Sarah created what appeared to be blood drops on several rocks and a larger stain on a torn piece of the shirt. To a casual observer, even one with tracking experience, it would suggest an injury to one of the fugitives, redirecting pursuit along this false trail out of both predatory instinct and the assumption that wounded prey would be easier to catch. The technique was one she had employed during the war when helping wounded civilians escape areas being swept by Confederate patrols. It had proven effective then, and Sarah calculated it would buy them critical time now. With the false trail established, she doubled back, using techniques to minimize her own tracks. Walking on stone surfaces, using fallen logs as bridges, and brushing away any clear footprints with a branch carefully wielded to avoid creating obvious sweep marks. When she finally reached the lightning-struck oak where her children waited, Sarah found them perfectly concealed, just as she had taught. Emma had positioned James and Rebecca in a shallow depression beneath the tree's massive exposed roots, covering them partially with leaf litter and positioning herself at an angle that allowed vigilance while maintaining concealment. 7 riders. "Passed while you were gone, Mama," Emma reported in a whisper. "Not the sheriff, different men. They were looking at the ground and talking about railroad markers." Sarah processed this new information with concern. Survey crews, moving more rapidly than anticipated, complicated their situation. More people in the area meant additional potential threats, but also potential resources if managed carefully. "Did they come close to your position?" Sarah asked, checking each child quickly for signs of exposure or fatigue. Emma shook her head. "They stayed on the main trail. One looked our direction but didn't see us." "Excellent work," Sarah praised, distributing small pieces of jerky as both nourishment and reward. She consulted the position of the sun through the cloud cover, calculating they had approximately 4 hours of daylight remaining. "We need to make more distance before dusk." As they continued westward, Sarah maintained a watchful vigilance for signs of pursuit while assessing each of her children's condition. James showed remarkable stamina for an 8-year-old, but Rebecca's pace was slowing, her small legs struggling with the uneven terrain. Soon, Sarah shifted her own pack to accommodate the additional weight of carrying her youngest on her back. "Tell me about the hospital tents again, Mama," Rebecca requested as they walked, small arms wrapped trustingly around Sarah's neck. The request for storytelling was partly childish comfort-seeking and partly Rebecca's natural strategy for distracting herself from discomfort, a surprising emotional intelligence in one so young. Sarah obliged, carefully selecting stories appropriate for young ears while maintaining situational awareness. "The hospital tents were enormous, bigger than our entire house," she began, adjusting Rebecca's weight slightly. White canvas that glowed like paper lanterns when the lamps were lit inside at night. We had 100 cots in the largest tent, arranged in precise rows with exactly 3 feet between each to allow the stretcher bearers and nurses to move quickly when needed. "And you were in charge of everyone. James interjected proudly from just behind them. "I was Chief Nursing Officer for the 3rd Division Medical Corps," Sarah confirmed, automatically correcting the exaggeration while acknowledging the truth of her responsibility. That meant organizing supplies, training new nurses, establishing procedures, and ensuring proper care for every patient. "Even the enemy soldiers," Emma added, demonstrating her understanding of one of her mother's most firmly held principles. "Every wounded person deserves care," Sarah affirmed. "That's the medical oath. During war, men fight under orders and flags, but blood runs the same color regardless of the uniform it's beneath." This philosophy, radical to many of her contemporaries, had guided Sarah through 4 years of battlefield medicine. It had also led to her most significant act of courage: the treatment and subsequent assistance of Black Hawk, the wounded Comanche warrior who had been brought to her field hospital by mistake during the chaotic aftermath of a skirmish near the Kansas border. As they walked, Sarah's mind returned to that fateful day. The young warrior had been grievously wounded. A cavalry saber had opened a deep gash across his chest, and he had lost significant blood. Military protocol demanded that enemy combatants receive treatment only after all Union soldiers had been attended to, effectively condemning many to death by delay. Sarah had defied this policy, recognizing the severity of Black Hawk's wounds required immediate intervention. Using techniques she had developed through years of battlefield surgery, combined with poultices made according to methods she had learned by observing native healers, she had stopped the bleeding and prevented infection that would certainly have claimed his life. During his recovery, hidden within her supply tent, away from administrative oversight, they had developed a rudimentary communication despite language barriers. Black Hawk had recognized both her skill and her courage in treating him against regulations. Upon his recovery, when she had helped him escape rather than face imprisonment, he had given her the bone amulet she still wore, a token of protection and recognition among his people. "If you ever journey to the Sunset Lands," he had told her through a mixture of broken English and gesture, "show this to my people. They will remember the healing woman who respects the old ways and the new." At the time, Sarah had considered it unlikely she would ever need to call upon this promised debt. Now, it represented their best hope for survival. By late afternoon, dark clouds had fully obscured the sun, and the intermittent snowflakes had become more numerous, though still melting upon contact with the ground. The temperature was dropping more rapidly than Sarah had anticipated, and the wind carried a bitter edge that penetrated their clothing. "We need proper shelter for the night," she announced, assessing both the weather conditions and her children's increasing fatigue. The emotional resources required to maintain vigilance while managing fear had depleted their energy as much as the physical exertion of travel. Just ahead, a small copse of trees surrounded what appeared to be an abandoned trapper's cabin. Little more than a 3-sided shelter with a partially collapsed roof, but significantly better than exposure to the elements. Sarah approached cautiously, years of experience having taught her that abandoned structures often found new inhabitants of either the human or animal variety. After a careful inspection that revealed no signs of recent occupation, Sarah determined the structure was safe enough for temporary use. Its eastern wall had partially collapsed, but the remaining 3 sides were intact, and the roof maintained enough integrity to provide worthwhile protection from precipitation. "Emma, help James collect dry branches for a small fire. Stay within sight of the cabin. Rebecca, you help me clear space inside." As the children set to their tasks, Sarah conducted a more thorough assessment of their shelter. The collapse section actually provided an advantage. It allowed her to position their fire where smoke would dissipate quickly without being trapped inside the structure, yet still provide heat to the enclosed space, using techniques developed for creating field hospitals in less than ideal conditions. Sarah improvised improvements to their shelter. The canvas sheets were positioned to create a windbreak across the open wall while still allowing ventilation. Branches were arranged to support the weakened sections of roof. A small drainage trench was quickly dug to direct any water seepage away from their sleeping area. By the time darkness fell, they had created a remarkably serviceable shelter. A small, carefully managed fire provided essential warmth while minimizing visible light that might attract attention. Sarah had prepared a simple but nourishing meal from their supplies, ensuring each child received an appropriate portion for their size and energy expenditure. As they ate, Sarah maintained her habit of educational conversation, another technique developed during the war to distract frightened young soldiers from their pain while simultaneously preparing them for continued challenges. "What 3 things do we need most right now?" she asked, making it a lesson disguised as mealtime discussion. "Food, shelter, and safety," Emma answered promptly. "Good. And what will become our primary concern over the next days?" James considered carefully before responding. "Transportation? We need to move faster than walking." "Excellent assessment." Sarah nodded approvingly. "On foot, our journey to Comanche territory would take nearly 3 weeks. With winter approaching, that timeline presents unacceptable risk. We need horses, at least 2, to reduce our travel time to approximately 1 week. "Where will we get horses, Mama?" Rebecca asked, her small face serious in the firelight. Sarah hesitated, calculating how much information was appropriate to share with children their age. Her philosophy had always favored honesty, calibrated to understanding rather than deception, but some truths required careful presentation. "There are several possibilities," she answered thoughtfully. "We might trade for them using the emergency funds your father and I saved. Or we might find horses that have been abandoned or separated from their owners." Emma, sharp as always, caught the deliberate vagueness in her mother's answer. "You mean we might need to take them without asking?" she stated directly, without judgment. Sarah met her daughter's gaze steadily. "In circumstances where survival is at stake, and when those who should offer assistance have instead created danger, we sometimes must make difficult choices." This was another lesson from her war experience, the moral complexity of survival in hostile territory. Sarah had never taken anything unnecessarily during the war, but she had occasionally appropriated resources when essential to saving lives under her care, particularly when those resources were hoarded by those with abundance. While others suffered, like when you took medicine from the supply officer who was selling it instead of giving it to wounded soldiers, James recalled from one of her carefully edited war stories. "Similar circumstances require similar decisions," Sarah acknowledged. "But we take only what is absolutely necessary, harm no one in the process, and remember our debt to repay when possible." As the children settled into sleep, huddled together beneath blankets in the most protected corner of the shelter, Sarah maintained her watch. The snow had begun accumulating on the ground outside their shelter, earlier than she had calculated, but not yet enough to significantly hamper travel. More concerning was the distinctive pattern of the clouds visible during brief breaks in the snowfall, which suggested a larger storm system approaching. Their timeline was compressing. Sarah adjusted her mental calculations, plotting alternative routes that might provide better shelter options during heavier weather, while still making progress toward their destination. Every hour brought Sheriff Benton and his men closer to discovering their true path rather than the false trail she had created. Tomorrow would require both caution and bold action. They would need to locate the railroad survey crew Emma had observed, assess whether they represented opportunity or threat, and potentially acquire the transportation they desperately needed. Sarah checked the revolver once more, hoping its use wouldn't become necessary, but prepared for that possibility. As snowflakes accumulated on the ground outside their shelter, Sarah's mind returned to Black Hawk and the Comanche territories, still many miles distant. The journey ahead would test every skill she had developed during years of war and frontier. living. But watching her children's steady breathing as they slept, Sarah felt the same resolute determination that had carried her through battlefield hospitals where others faltered. They would survive this journey. The people of Clearwater, who had so callously abandoned them, would never understand the depth of their miscalculation. In turning away a widow and her children, they had not created victims, but unleashed a woman whose experiences had forged extraordinary capabilities, a woman who would cross territories and tribal boundaries to ensure her children's survival by any means necessary. Dawn broke with painful brightness, sunlight reflecting off the fresh snow that had accumulated overnight. Sarah had maintained her vigilance through alternating periods of rest and watchfulness, a technique perfected during long nights in field hospitals when continuous alert presence was necessary but uninterrupted wakefulness impossible. She estimated perhaps 3 inches of snowfall, enough to significantly impede their progress on foot, but not yet deep enough to make travel impossible. The first priority was assessing their surroundings in daylight. While the children still slept, Sarah conducted a careful reconnaissance of the area immediately surrounding their shelter. The snow complicated their situation in contradictory ways. It would make their tracks more visible to pursuers, but it would also obscure the false trail she had created the previous day. Sheriff Benton and his men would eventually realize their deception, but the snow might delay that discovery, providing precious additional hours. More pressing was her discovery of fresh hoof prints approximately 200 yards west of their position. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace, had passed sometime during the early morning hours while the snow was still falling. Based on the partial filling of the tracks with fresh snow, Sarah estimated they had passed approximately 2 hours earlier. The tracks confirmed Emma's report of survey crews in the area. The pattern and spacing indicated 4 riders moving together, likely heading toward a base camp or work site. Sarah calculated that following these tracks might lead to opportunities, both for gathering intelligence about potential pursuit and for solving their transportation problem. When she returned to the shelter, Emma was already awake and rekindling the small fire with careful precision. The girl looked up at her mother with quiet understanding beyond her years. "There are horse tracks nearby," Sarah confirmed, answering the unasked question in her daughter's eyes. "We'll follow them after breakfast." As James and Rebecca awakened, Sarah prepared a carefully measured meal from their supplies, preserving their limited resources while ensuring sufficient calories for the day's exertion. While they ate, she outlined the plan with appropriate detail for each child's comprehension level. "We'll follow the tracks to locate the survey camp," she explained. "They'll have information, supplies, and horses. Emma, you'll help me observe the camp while James and Rebecca wait at a safe distance." "Are these people dangerous, Mama?" James asked, his expression serious as he pulled on his mittens. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Not intentionally, perhaps, but they work for the railroad company, which means they're connected to the bank that tried to take our land. They might return us to Clearwater if they recognize us." This measured explanation, balancing honesty with appropriate detail, was another skill developed during war, when patients needed to understand their situation without being overwhelmed by medical specifics that might heighten anxiety without improving outcomes. They departed within the hour, leaving minimal evidence of their overnight presence. The snow had stopped falling, but heavy clouds promised more precipitation before nightfall. Sarah estimated they had perhaps 6 hours of relatively clear weather for travel and reconnaissance. Following the tracks required little specialized skill. The fresh impressions in the snow created an obvious trail heading northwest. Sarah maintained a steady pace, suitable for the children, while frequently scanning their surroundings for any signs of pursuit from the direction of Clearwater. After approximately 4 miles, Rebecca's energy began flagging despite her determined efforts to keep pace. Without comment, Sarah smoothly transitioned to carrying her youngest on her back again, adjusting their belongings to maintain balance and mobility while supporting the additional weight. "Tell me what you hear," Sarah prompted as they walked, turning Rebecca's position into an advantage by making her their rear lookout. The girl took this responsibility seriously, reporting distant bird calls, the occasional snap of ice-laden branches, and once the faint sound of what might have been a gunshot far to the east, a hunter perhaps, or possibly their pursuers discovering the false trail. Sarah noted each observation with appropriate acknowledgement, fostering Rebecca's developing awareness while monitoring their surroundings with her own heightened senses. By mid-morning, a thin column of smoke became visible, rising above a stand of trees approximately a mile ahead. Sarah halted their progress, assessing the situation with practiced caution. "That's their camp," she confirmed, helping Rebecca down from her back and guiding all three children to a sheltered position behind a granite outcropping that offered both concealment and protection from the wind. "I need to investigate closer. Before we proceed." From her pack, Sarah retrieved a small brass telescope, another relic from her military service used during her time with the mobile field hospitals to identify approaching wounded from a distance and prepare appropriate medical responses. The instrument extended to reveal surprising magnification power despite its compact size. "Emma, maintain watch here with your brother and sister. If I'm not back in 2 hours, follow this creek southward until you reach the fork we passed earlier. Then head west, as we discussed." The contingency instructions were delivered matter-of-factly, without drama, but with clear expectation of compliance. Sarah had always believed that children rose to the level of responsibility they were shown capable of handling, a philosophy affirmed repeatedly during her war service when young drummer boys and message runners had demonstrated remarkable courage under the most harrowing circumstances. Emma nodded soberly, accepting the small timepiece Sarah handed her for tracking the designated period. 2 hours exactly, then south to the fork and west toward the territories. "Precisely." Sarah checked her revolver once more, adjusting her clothing to conceal it while keeping it accessible. "Remember, complete silence and perfect stillness." James finished for her, demonstrating his understanding of their situation's seriousness despite his youth. With a final reassuring touch to each child's shoulder, Sarah moved toward the survey camp alone, employing the approach techniques she had learned from scout units during the war. Moving from cover to cover, she made a wide arc that brought her to a ridgeline overlooking the encampment from the north, a position that provided excellent visibility while maintaining her concealment. Through her telescope, Sarah observed a well-organized operation consisting of 3 large canvas tents, a cook fire, and approximately 8 men moving with the efficient purpose of experienced surveyors. Their equipment was substantial, multiple transits mounted on tripods, chain, measuring tools, and mapping tables protected from the elements by oiled canvas coverings. Most significant for Sarah's immediate concerns were the 7 horses picketed at the eastern edge of the camp. The animals appeared well-maintained, essential transportation for survey crews working across extensive territory. 2 wagon teams of draft horses stood hitched nearby, presumably for moving heavier equipment between locations. As she observed the camp's activities, Sarah's attention was drawn to a conversation between 2 men near the central tent. Though distance prevented her from hearing their words, their gestures toward maps spread across a portable table suggested planning discussions. What caught Sarah's notice was the arrival of a 3rd man who approached with obvious urgency, pointing eastward, the direction of Clearwater. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, using a technique developed during reconnaissance of field hospital locations to improve her vantage point without exposing herself. The newcomer's agitated movements and the reaction of the others suggested information of significance had arrived. When one man retrieved a rifle from a nearby rack, her suspicions deepened. A messenger from town had reached the survey crew, likely carrying news about the missing widow and her children, possibly with instructions to watch for them. The survey crew's response indicated cooperation with Clearwater authorities, eliminating any possibility of approaching them openly for assistance. Sarah calculated their options with the dispassionate clarity crisis had always evoked in her. Direct confrontation remained inadvisable. Requesting assistance was no longer viable. The necessity of acquiring transportation had become more urgent with the confirmation that active search efforts were expanding beyond Sheriff Benton's initial pursuit. Retreating to her children's position, Sarah found them exactly as she had left them, vigilant, silent, and well concealed. The pride she felt at their discipline was tempered by concern for the intensifying danger of their situation. "The camp has been alerted to look for us," she explained without preamble, knowing that clarity served them better than comforting. "Omissions. They have horses we need, but we cannot approach directly." "Are we going to take some of their horses, Mama?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah met her son's questioning gaze directly. "Yes. It's necessary for our survival now." She outlined her plan with the same precision she had once used when directing emergency surgical teams during battlefield crises. Each child was assigned specific responsibilities appropriate to their capabilities, with clear instructions and contingencies. "We'll wait until dusk," Sarah concluded. "Sarah, the timing provides optimal conditions for our approach, while allowing sufficient distance before full darkness makes travel hazardous." The hours until evening stretched with the peculiar elasticity of time experienced during periods of anticipation and anxiety. Sarah used the wait constructively, reviewing each element of their plan repeatedly with the children while ensuring they rested adequately for the exertion ahead. She also prepared what limited equipment they had, fashioning improvised halters from rope in her pack and creating simple saddlebags from canvas to carry their essential supplies. As the winter sun began its early descent, Sarah led her children on a circuitous approach to the survey camp, using terrain features to maintain concealment. The surveyors had continued their work throughout the day, teams spreading out across the surrounding area with their equipment before returning to camp as daylight faded. Positioned behind a dense thicket approximately 100 yards from where the horses were picketed, Sarah made final adjustments to their plan based on current observations. The camp had established a watch rotation with one man positioned near the horses while others gathered around the central fire for the evening meal. "Remember," Sarah whispered to Emma and James, "approach from downwind exactly as we practiced. Horses respond to confidence and calm. Move deliberately without sudden gestures." The children nodded solemnly, their young faces showing the focused concentration Sarah had cultivated in them through years of turning necessary skills into structured learning experiences. Rebecca, too young for direct participation, would remain with Sarah until the older children had secured 2 horses. Sarah checked that the bone amulet from Black Hawk was securely fastened around her neck, then nodded to Emma and James. "Go!" The children moved with remarkable stealth for their age, utilizing the approach pattern Sarah had specified. Their small sizes were advantageous, less likely to trigger the horse's flight instincts than an adult's larger presence. Emma led with natural confidence, her movements fluid and purposeful, as she had been taught. Sarah watched through her telescope, ready to create a distraction if necessary. Her hand rested near the revolver, though she desperately hoped its use wouldn't become necessary. Taking the horses was justified by survival necessity, but she had no desire to harm anyone in the process. Emma and James reached the picket line without detection, the evening activities of the camp providing sufficient cover for their approach. With practiced movements, learned from caring for their own horses before the fire, Emma untied two of the animals while James stood ready with the improvised halters. The moment of greatest risk came as they began leading the horses away from the line. One animal nickered softly, causing the watchman to look up from the small fire where he'd been warming his hands. Sarah tensed, preparing to implement their contingency plan if he raised an alarm, whether through providence or the gathering darkness. The man returned his attention to the fire without noticing the children or the two horses now being quietly led away. Emma and James continued their careful withdrawal, moving with the patience Sarah had emphasized during their preparation. Rushing would only startle the animals and draw unwanted attention. When they reached the thicket where Sarah waited with Rebecca, relief flooded momentarily through her before practical necessity reasserted itself. They needed to put significant distance between themselves and the camp before the missing horses were discovered. "Well done," she whispered, helping. Rebecca mounted behind Emma on the larger of the two horses, a sturdy bay gelding with a gentle temperament. Sarah secured their packs to the second horse, a smaller pinto mare, before mounting herself. "Now we ride west, staying among the trees as long as possible." The acquisition of horses transformed their situation dramatically. What would have been another exhausting day of walking became steady progress across the increasingly snow-covered landscape. Sarah set a careful pace, balancing the need for distance with consideration for the animal's energy and the children's limited riding experience. As full darkness descended, Sarah navigated using the occasional glimpses of stars visible through breaks in the cloud cover. Her time with mobile field hospitals had honed her navigational skills. Units frequently relocated under cover of darkness to avoid artillery targeting, requiring precise directional movement without obvious landmarks or illumination. They rode for approximately 3 hours before Sarah determined they had established sufficient distance to risk a brief rest. The horses needed water, and the children, despite their remarkable endurance, were showing signs of fatigue from the tension and physical demands of the day. A small stream provided water for both humans and animals. Sarah allowed only a short stop, perhaps 20 minutes, before insisting they continue. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and movement generated essential body heat that would help prevent dangerous cold exposure. "How far to the Comanche?" "Lands, Mama?" James asked as they remounted, his voice steady despite the obvious tiredness in his small frame. 4 days with the horses if weather permits," Sarah answered honestly. "Possibly longer if the snow worsens." She didn't share her deeper concern that their tracks in the snow would be easily followed once the missing horses were discovered. The survey crew, unlike Sheriff Benton and his men, had resources and legitimate reasons to pursue them. They would likely send riders at first light. Their only advantage now was distance and direction. Few white settlers would willingly follow them into territory known to be frequented by Comanche hunting parties. The very danger that most would avoid was paradoxically their greatest hope for safety. Around midnight, when the children could no longer maintain alertness despite their determined efforts, Sarah located a sheltered ravine that offered natural protection from the wind and concealment from casual observation. Using techniques developed for establishing field hospital outposts, she created a minimalist camp that provided essential warmth while remaining easily abandoned if necessary. 3 hours of rest, she informed Emma as she helped the exhausted children from horseback. "Then we continue before dawn." As the children huddled together beneath blankets near the small, carefully shielded fire, Sarah tended to the horses, checking their hooves for snow accumulation and rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass to remove moisture from their coats. The animals were trail-hardened and accustomed to work in difficult conditions, a fortunate circumstance that improved their chances significantly. Only when these essential tasks were completed did Sarah allow herself a brief period of rest. Seated with her back against a boulder that retained some warmth from the fire, she maintained semi-alert watchfulness while her body recovered minimally from the day's exertions. The revolver lay across her lap, loaded and ready. Her thoughts turned to Thomas, as they often did during quiet moments. He would have understood her decisions, the necessity of taking the horses, the calculated risk of heading into Comanche territory. Though a peaceful man by nature, he had recognized the harsh realities of frontier life and the occasional requirement for difficult choices in service of survival. They had met during the war. Thomas had been a quartermaster sergeant, responsible for medical supplies when Sarah was assigned to the 3rd Division Field Hospital. Unlike many of the officers and men who had dismissed the nurses as mere women playing at medicine, Thomas had recognized and respected their essential skills and knowledge. Their courtship had been conducted amid the chaotic background of war. Brief conversations during supply deliveries, shared meals when opportunity allowed, letters exchanged through the military postal system during separations. Thomas had admired Sarah's competence and courage. She had appreciated his quiet integrity and practical intelligence. When peace finally came, their decision to head west rather than return to established eastern communities had been mutual. Both had seen too much death and destruction too easily readjust to conventional society. The frontier offered space, independence, and the opportunity to build something untainted by war's brutal memories. For 8 years, they had created that life together, establishing their farm, welcoming their children, developing connections within the Clearwater community. Thomas had never fully understood why Sarah maintained certain habits from her war service: the emergency supplies, the vigilant awareness, the contingency planning, but he had accepted them as part of who she was. Now those same habits, once seeming perhaps excessive in peaceful times, were preserving their children's lives. Sarah allowed herself a moment of grief for all they had lost: their home, their connection to community, and most painfully, Thomas himself. Then, with the same disciplined compartmentalization that had allowed her to function amid battlefield horrors, she set aside emotion to focus on immediate survival requirements. The sky had partially cleared, revealing a brilliant display of stars across the western horizon. Sarah oriented herself precisely, confirming their direction of travel for the coming day. Somewhere ahead lay the territories where Black Hawk's people moved with the seasons, following game and maintaining the ancient patterns of life that predated white settlement. Whether her reception would match Black Hawk's promised welcome remained uncertain. Years had passed, allegiances shifted, and territories changed hands through both treaty and conquest. The bone amulet she wore might mean nothing to those who encountered them, or it might make the critical difference between death and survival. As the children slept, their breathing forming small clouds in the cold night air, Sarah renewed her silent commitment to their preservation. They would reach Comanche lands. They would find Black Hawk or his people. They would survive this journey, no matter what challenges emerged. The people of Clearwater, who had abandoned them to winter and starvation, would never understand the profound error of their judgment, that in turning away a seeming widow with 3 small children, they had instead unleashed a woman whose experiences had forged exceptional capabilities, whose determination knew no conventional limits when protecting those under her care. Sarah checked the horses once more, adjusted the blankets around her, sleeping children, and prepared herself for the difficult days ahead. The survey crew would discover their missing horses at dawn. Pursuit would follow. Weather would worsen as winter strengthened its grip on the territory. Against these challenges stood a single woman armed with knowledge, determination, and skills forged in America's bloodiest conflict. Sarah Mitchell, once Captain Sarah Holloway of the Army Medical Corps, calculated their odds with the cool, assessment that had once helped her save lives when others saw only inevitable death. The odds were sufficient. They would endure. They would survive. True to her calculated timeline, Sarah roused the children 3 hours later. The temperature had dropped further during their brief rest, and frost had formed on the blankets despite the proximity of their small fire. Emma awakened immediately with the situational awareness Sarah had cultivated in her eldest, while James and Rebecca required gentle persistence to fully rouse from the deep sleep of exhausted children. "We need to move before first light," Sarah explained as she helped them prepare, her tone compassionate but firm. "The survey crew will discover the missing horses at dawn." She had allowed herself only brief moments of rest, using most of the stopover to care for the horses and monitor their surroundings. Experience had taught her that the body could function effectively on minimal sleep when necessary, a lesson learned during extended surgical sessions when wounded arrived in overwhelming numbers, requiring continuous attention for 30 or more hours. The pre-dawn darkness was penetrating, but Sarah navigated confidently, using the stars still visible through occasional breaks in the clouds. Their westward trajectory followed natural features that provided both concealment and the path of least resistance for the horses: creek beds, shallow valleys, and gaps between hillsides. As they rode, Sarah continually assessed each child's condition. Emma maintained remarkable composure, her back straight despite fatigue, supporting Rebecca, who dozed fitfully in front of her. James struggled more visibly on the pinto mare, his small body tense with the effort of maintaining his seat while fighting exhaustion. "Tell me about the Comanche healing methods, Mama," James requested, as they navigated a particularly dense stretch of woodland, his voice betraying both tiredness and his deliberate effort to remain alert. Sarah recognized the tactic. James often requested stories or information when he needed distraction from discomfort. She obliged, knowing that conversation would help all of them maintain focus while sharing knowledge that might prove valuable in the days ahead. "The Comanche approach to medicine differs fundamentally from what I was taught in nursing school," she began, selecting information appropriate for young listeners while substantial enough to engage their attention. "They understand connections between body, spirit, and environment that Western medicine often ignores." As they rode, Sarah described the herbal preparations she had observed during her brief interaction with Black Hawk and other indigenous patients, treated clandestinely at her field hospital. She explained the remarkable effectiveness of certain poultices for preventing infection, the use of specific roots for pain management, and the ceremonial aspects that Western medicine dismissed, but which she had come to respect for their psychological benefits to healing. "When I treated Black Hawk's chest wound, conventional wisdom said he would develop infection and fever. The surgeons would have amputated limbs with similar injuries, but I used a combination of standard cleaning techniques and a poultice he instructed me to prepare from plants growing near our camp. His recovery was remarkable, faster and with less scarring than I had ever witnessed with traditional methods alone." The story served multiple purposes: maintaining the children's focus, preparing them for potential cultural differences ahead, and reinforcing Sarah's credibility with the Comanche they hoped to encounter. Emma absorbed the information with particular interest, having already shown aptitude for the medical knowledge Sarah occasionally shared from her professional experience. The eastern horizon had just begun showing the first faint lightening of dawn when Sarah detected something that raised immediate concern: the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders moving at speed. The survey crew had discovered their missing horses sooner than anticipated. "Change of plans," she announced calmly, immediately altering their direction toward a densely wooded hillside to their south. "We need to use terrain to our advantage now." Years of tactical movement with mobile field hospitals had honed Sarah's ability to identify defensible positions and concealment opportunities. The pine-covered slope ahead offered both. The dense undergrowth would hamper mounted pursuit, while the elevation would provide observation advantages. Emma, take the lead. Follow the game trail that enters the trees at that lightning-struck pine. James, stay close behind. I'll cover our tracks where possible. The children responded without question, instinctively understanding the urgency in their mother's tone. As Emma guided their horse toward the indicated trail, Sarah dismounted briefly to obscure their most obvious tracks where they diverged from their previous path. Using a branch to brush snow over hoofprints was minimally effective, but might create momentary confusion for pursuers. The wooded slope provided exactly the advantages Sarah had identified. The dense pines created natural barriers to mounted travel, forcing pursuers to either dismount or circumnavigate the thickest areas. Sarah led them along a winding path that maximized these natural defenses while maintaining their general westward progression. From higher elevation, partially concealed behind a massive fallen log, Sarah used her telescope to observe the pursuit. 4 riders had reached the point where she had attempted to obscure their trail. Even at distance, she could identify the systematic search pattern of experienced trackers as they quartered the area, seeking sign of their direction. "How many, Mama?" Emma whispered, demonstrating her grasp of their situation's seriousness. 4 riders, Sarah confirmed. "Likely the survey crew foreman and selected men. They're searching for our trail now." "Will they find it?" James asked, his young face solemn as he held the horse's reins. Sarah balanced honesty with reassurance. Another skill refined through years of treating gravely wounded soldiers who needed both truth and hope. "Eventually, yes, but we've gained valuable time and position. Now we need to use that advantage wisely." Their position overlooking the pursuers offered a crucial opportunity to observe without being seen. Sarah noted that 2 of the men carried rifles in saddle scabbards, standard equipment for survey crews in potentially dangerous territory, but a concerning escalation in their current circumstances. "We'll continue through the forest rather than returning to open ground," she decided, calculating relative speeds and directions. "The terrain will slow us, but will hamper them more significantly." For the next several hours, Sarah guided her family through the dense woodland, following game trails where possible, but often creating their own path. The horses struggled occasionally with the uneven ground and low-hanging branches, but the animals' intelligence and sure-footedness proved invaluable. By mid-morning, Sarah estimated they had maintained their lead on the pursuers, possibly even extended it. The children had demonstrated remarkable resilience, but fatigue was becoming increasingly evident. Rebecca had fallen fully asleep, despite the difficult terrain, secured against Emma by Sarah's improvised harness created from rope and canvas. James fought to maintain alertness, but his responses were slowing, his small body swaying slightly with exhaustion. "We'll stop briefly," Sarah announced, identifying a small clearing beside a spring-fed stream that offered both water and visibility in multiple directions. 15 minutes only, but we all need water and the horses require rest." The temperature had risen marginally with the sun, but remained well below freezing. Sarah helped the children dismount, noting with clinical assessment how each moved, with the stiffness of cold and extended riding. After ensuring they drank water and consumed small portions of jerky for energy, she attended to the horses, checking hooves for packed snow and ice, providing water, and assessing them for signs of excessive fatigue. "Emma, help your brother and sister move around gently to restore circulation," she instructed as she worked. "Small exercises like we practiced during winter travel." Emma nodded, immediately organizing James and Rebecca in the simple movement routines Sarah had taught them. Gentle stretches, small space walking patterns, and arm rotations designed to improve blood flow without excessive exertion. The children performed these activities with the serious focus Sarah had cultivated in them, understanding their practical necessity rather than viewing them as arbitrary instructions. As they prepared to remount, Sarah detected a sound that instantly heightened her vigilance. Voices carried faintly on the wind from the direction they had come. The pursuers had either gained ground more rapidly than she had calculated or had split their party to cover more territory. "Change of plans," she announced with calm efficiency, immediately adjusting their approach. "We'll leave the horses here temporarily and proceed on foot for reconnaissance." Sarah's use of military terminology wasn't deliberate. In moments of crisis, her language often reverted to the precise technical vocabulary of her war service. The children understood the essential meaning nonetheless, responding with the immediate compliance she had trained them to show when urgency required it. After securing the horses where they could access water but remain partially concealed by evergreen undergrowth, Sarah led her children up a rocky incline that provided superior observation position without exposing them to view from below. Experience had taught her that elevation advantages often proved decisive in asymmetrical confrontations. From their vantage point among lichen-covered boulders, Sarah used her telescope to assess the approaching threat. 2 riders were following their trail with methodical precision, one clearly reading sign while the other maintained vigilant watch of the surrounding territory. Their movement patterns indicated professional competence, likely the most experienced trackers from the survey crew. 2 men approaching from the southeast, Sarah reported quietly to Emma, who had proven capable of comprehending tactical situations beyond her years. Moving carefully but steadily. Their current path will bring them to the clearing within 20 minutes. The situation required immediate decision, continue their flight with the horses and risk direct confrontation with pursuing riders, or attempt evasion on foot, sacrificing speed for concealment. Sarah calculated variables with the clinical detachment she had developed during battlefield crises, where emotional responses hindered optimal decision-making. "We'll circle around them," she determined after brief analysis. "James, Rebecca, and I will create a false trail heading north, while Emma recovers the horses and takes them westward along the stream, where they'll leave minimal tracks. We'll rendezvous at the lightning-struck oak we passed approximately 1 mile ahead." The plan leveraged their primary advantage. The pursuers were tracking a family of 4 with 2 horses, not anticipating tactical maneuvers designed to separate and confuse pursuit. Sarah had employed similar techniques when relocating field hospitals under threat of enemy cavalry approach. Emma received these instructions with remarkable composure for a 10-year-old, asking only the most pertinent clarifying questions. "How long should I wait at the oak if you haven't arrived?" 2 hours precisely, Sarah answered, handing Emma the timepiece. "If we haven't rejoined you by then, continue westward following the sun, keeping this ridgeline to your right until you reach the river we discussed." The contingency instructions acknowledged the possibility of capture or worse, an honest assessment Sarah would never shield her children from when their survival might depend on such knowledge. Emma's solemn nod demonstrated her understanding of both the instructions and their implications. With practiced efficiency, Sarah prepared James and Rebecca for their role in the deception. Using techniques learned from scouts during the war, she instructed them in walking patterns that maximized track visibility in strategic locations while minimizing actual noise and movement. "Remember how we played fox and hounds on the journey west," she reminded them, framing necessary survival skills as familiar games to reduce fear while maintaining compliance. "We're leaving a trick trail for the hounds to follow, while the clever foxes circle around to safety." As Emma moved carefully back toward the horses, Sarah led her younger children on an exaggerated northward path, deliberately creating visible tracks in patches of snow and disturbing undergrowth in ways that suggested hasty passage of multiple individuals. At key points, she implemented specific deceptions, placing a small, torn piece of Rebecca's hair ribbon on a thorny branch, disturbing a fallen log as though someone had rested briefly, creating what appeared to be a child's footprint pressed deliberately into a patch of soft earth. Each element of the false trail was calculated to draw pursuers northward, away from their actual planned route, while suggesting a family fleeing in haste rather than executing a tactical deception. When they had extended the false trail approximately a quarter-mile, Sarah directed her children in a careful reversal, using techniques to minimize their actual return tracks. Walking on stones, using fallen logs as bridges, staying on patches of exposed ground where snow hadn't accumulated. The maneuver required significant time, nearly 45 minutes to create the false trail and return to their starting position without being detected. Sarah maintained constant vigilance throughout, aware that success depended entirely on avoiding direct observation by the approaching trackers. When they finally reached the location where the stream curved westward, their planned route to the rendezvous point, Sarah detected voices much closer than anticipated. The pursuers had reached the clearing where they had briefly rested and were examining the area with professional thoroughness. "Down and still," Sarah whispered, guiding James and Rebecca into a shallow depression beneath the exposed roots of a massive pine that had partially fallen during some long-ago storm. The natural hollow offered concealment provided they remained perfectly motionless. From their hiding place, Sarah could hear the men's conversation without seeing them directly, a circumstance that heightened tension but provided valuable intelligence. "Two sets of tracks heading north in a hurry," one voice reported. "Woman's and children's prints, clear as day." "What about the horses?" questioned the second man. "Harder to tell. Ground's disturbed around here, but they definitely watered them. The stream could have followed the water to hide their trail." Clever thinking for a woman. The conditional compliment carried the dismissive tone Sarah had encountered throughout her professional life, men consistently underestimating female capabilities despite evidence to the contrary. In this instance, such prejudice worked to their advantage. "Mitchell's widow didn't strike me as the wilderness type," the second voice commented. "Banker said she was an Easterner, city-bred. War changes people," the first man replied, his tone suggesting personal experience. "Heard she was a nurse during the fighting. Those women saw things that would turn your stomach." The brief exchange confirmed Sarah's assessment that these weren't simply survey crew members pursuing stolen horses. They had specific knowledge of her identity and circumstances. The connection to the banker in Clearwater verified her suspicion that financial interests in her property were driving the pursuit as much as the missing horses. "Let's follow the northern trail," the first tracker decided. "Jackson and Miller can continue searching westward when they catch up. Woman with 3 young ones can't move fast in this terrain, especially with snow coming in again by nightfall." The men's voices faded as they moved away, following the false trail Sarah had created. She maintained their concealed position for nearly 15 minutes after the sounds disappeared, ensuring the pursuers had committed fully to the deception. Before proceeding, "Well done staying so still," she praised James and Rebecca when they finally emerged from hiding. "Now we move very carefully to meet Emma." The westward journey along the stream required meticulous attention to concealment. Sarah employed every technique developed during wartime reconnaissance, keeping to harder ground that wouldn't hold tracks, using the flowing water to eliminate scent and footprints where necessary, and maintaining continuous awareness of sight, lines, and potential observation points. Progress was necessarily slow, particularly with young children whose natural movements tended toward direct lines rather than tactical positioning. Sarah guided them with gentle physical redirection rather than verbal instructions that might carry in the still winter air. Approximately 40 minutes into their careful movement, snowflakes began falling again, initially scattered and lightweight, but gradually increasing in both size and frequency. While creating additional challenges for travel, the snowfall provided significant advantages for evasion, obscuring tracks almost as quickly as they were made. "The snow is helping us," Sarah explained quietly as they walked. "It's hiding our path like a white blanket covering our trail." This framing, presenting natural circumstances as advantageous rather than threatening, was another technique Sarah had developed during her war service. Young personnel facing battlefield hazards responded more effectively when encouraged to perceive elements of their environment as potential resources rather than merely obstacles. When they finally reached the lightning-struck oak that served as their rendezvous point, Sarah was relieved to find Emma already waiting with both horses, positioned with excellent tactical awareness behind a dense thicket that provided concealment while maintaining visibility of the approach paths. "No one followed or approached," Emma reported with the precision Sarah had cultivated in her. "I heard voices to the north approximately 20 minutes ago, but saw no one." "Well done," Sarah acknowledged, quickly assessing both horses and her eldest daughter for signs of stress or injury. Finding all in acceptable condition given the circumstances, she helped James and Rebecca mount before scanning their surroundings for immediate threats. The snowfall had intensified during their reunion, reducing visibility but also hampering potential pursuit. Sarah calculated their next movement with consideration for both advantages and limitations presented by the weather. "We'll continue westward but adjust our pace for conditions," she decided, mounting behind James on the Pinto mare. "The snow provides concealment but increases hazards. Careful observation is essential." As they resumed travel through the increasingly obscured landscape, Sarah maintained heightened vigilance while monitoring her children's condition. The combination of physical exertion, emotional stress, and environmental exposure was taking cumulative toll despite their remarkable resilience. What Sarah did not share with the children was her growing concern about the changing weather patterns. The snow's intensity and the distinctive cloud formations visible through occasional breaks in precipitation suggested they were encountering not merely a passing squall, but the leading edge of a substantial winter storm, potentially the major system she had previously calculated might arrive within days. If her assessment proved accurate, their situation would become significantly more precarious. Travel would slow or become impossible, shelter would become an immediate rather than periodic necessity, and the margin between survival and catastrophe would narrow drastically. Yet the same conditions that threatened them would similarly hamper their pursuers, potentially eliminating that threat entirely if the survey crew prioritized their own safety over recovery of horses or execution of the banker's apparent instructions regarding Sarah and her children. As darkness approached much earlier than normal due to heavy cloud cover, Sarah identified a sheltered ravine that offered natural protection from wind and sufficient timber for constructing improved shelter. The snowfall had accumulated to approximately 6 inches, with drifts significantly deeper in exposed areas. "We'll establish camp here for the night," she announced, selecting a position that combined defensibility with protection from elements. "The storm is worsening. Travel before morning would endanger both horses and riders." While Emma and James cared for the horses under her instruction, Sarah and Rebecca gathered materials for constructing their shelter. Using techniques developed for creating emergency medical stations during battlefield operations, Sarah efficiently established a well-organized camp despite limited resources and challenging conditions. The shelter consisted of canvas sheets positioned to create a snow-shedding roof anchored to living trees, with walls constructed of branches woven between saplings and packed with pine boughs for insulation. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind and toward a carefully managed fire, positioned to provide maximum heat with minimal smoke signature. Inside this improvised structure, Sarah created separate spaces for sleeping, equipment storage, and food preparation, bringing order to their wilderness survival that reflected the organizational systems she had implemented in field hospitals, where efficiency often meant the difference between life and death. As the children huddled near the fire, consuming the hot meals Sarah had prepared from their limited supplies, the wind intensified outside their shelter, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and confirming her assessment that a major storm system had arrived. "Will the men still be looking for us in this storm, Mama?" James asked, his voice carrying both worry and exhaustion. Sarah considered her response carefully, balancing honesty with appropriate reassurance. "If they're experienced frontiersmen, they'll seek substantial shelter until conditions improve. Their pursuit will likely pause, at least temporarily." This assessment was technically accurate while omitting her deeper concern, that the storm might also prevent their own progress toward Comanche territory, extending their journey beyond the supplies and endurance they had currently available. As she settled the children for sleep in the warmest section of their shelter, ensuring each had adequate covering despite their limited blankets, Sarah calculated timelines and resources with the dispassionate precision required for survival decision-making. Their supplies would last approximately 5 days, with careful rationing. The horses provided transportation, but required feed and care that became more challenging in deep snow. The storm might continue for 24 hours or several days, based on the atmospheric indicators she had observed. Most critically, their position remained well short of Comanche territory, where Sarah hoped to find Black Hawk or his people. The planned 4-day journey had already been extended by pursuit and weather, with further delays now inevitable given the storm's intensity. These calculations led to an inescapable conclusion. They would need to adapt their strategy significantly, focusing on immediate survival during the storm while preparing for accelerated travel when conditions permitted. The margin for error had disappeared entirely, requiring perfect execution of increasingly difficult survival requirements. As the children slept, Sarah maintained vigilance from a position where she could monitor both the shelter entrance and the fire that provided essential warmth. The revolver remained within immediate reach, loaded and ready, despite her hope that their pursuers had indeed sought their own shelter from the intensifying storm. Through the gaps in their improvised shelter wall, Sarah observed the snow accumulating at a rate that would transform the landscape by morning. The wilderness around them was becoming simultaneously more beautiful and more deadly, a paradox she had witnessed repeatedly during her years on the frontier. The people of Clearwater, who had so casually abandoned Sarah and her children to winter's mercy, could never have anticipated the subsequent events their decision would precipitate. In turning away a widow and her young family, they had set in motion circumstances that would ultimately reveal the profound depth of their miscalculation. For the woman they had dismissed as helpless was methodically navigating challenges that would have overwhelmed most seasoned frontiersmen, drawing on experiences and capabilities developed in America's bloodiest conflict, driven by the most powerful motivation human beings could experience: the protection of her children against all threats, whether from nature or human malice. The storm raged through the night with unrelenting intensity, transforming the forest into an alien landscape of white drifts and ice-encrusted trees. Sarah maintained her vigilance in alternating shifts of wakefulness and light rest, a rhythm her body remembered from years of tending the wounded, when sleep became a luxury, rationed in brief intervals. The shelter held against the battering wind, a testament to construction techniques refined through necessity during countless battlefield relocations. Dawn arrived with muted grayness rather than clear light, the storm having diminished marginally, but continuing with steady snowfall that limited visibility to perhaps 50 yards. Sarah's first assessment came from sound rather than sight. The distinctive hollow silence of deep snow accumulation surrounded them, broken only by the occasional crack of branches surrendering to the weight of ice and snow. Moving carefully, to avoid waking the children, Sarah exited the shelter to evaluate their situation. The transformation was more dramatic than even her experienced assessment had anticipated. Snow had accumulated to approximately 18 inches in level areas, with drifts reaching 3 feet or more where wind had sculpted the frozen precipitation against natural barriers. The horses stood huddled beneath the simple lean-to she had constructed adjacent to their shelter, their backs dusted with snow that had found its way through the inadequate roof. Both animals appeared alert but conserving energy, a positive sign given the circumstances. Sarah cleared their enclosure and provided water melted from snow, aware that maintaining the animals' condition remained essential to their survival strategy. Returning to the shelter, Sarah found Emma already awake and rekindling the fire with careful precision. The girl worked with quiet efficiency, having absorbed years of practical instruction in wilderness skills that Sarah had incorporated into daily life as naturally as other mothers taught household management. The storm's continuing, Sarah confirmed, answering the unasked question in her daughter's eyes. We'll remain here today and reassess by evening. As James and Rebecca awakened, Sarah organized their shelter with the systematic approach that had once brought order to chaotic field hospitals. Space was allocated for specific functions, supplies were arranged for efficient access, and tasks were assigned according to each person's capabilities. Emma, maintain the fire and help with meal preparation. James, assist me with improving the horses' shelter. Rebecca, sort our remaining supplies by category as we practice during summer travel. The structured activity served multiple purposes, creating necessary improvements to their situation, preventing the debilitating effects of idleness during confinement, and maintaining the children's sense of purpose and contribution. Sarah had witnessed how quickly wounded soldiers declined when deprived of meaningful function during recovery, their physical healing undermined by psychological stagnation. While the younger children worked inside, Sarah and James ventured out to reinforce the horses' shelter. Using techniques she had learned from cavalry quartermasters during winter campaigns, Sarah guided her son in packing snow against the exterior walls of the lean-to, creating insulation that would retain the animal's body heat while blocking wind. Why are we putting snow on the shelter? James asked as they worked, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Doesn't that make it colder? Sarah welcomed the question as an opportunity for practical education. Another habit developed during her nursing service when she had trained young assistants amid ongoing medical procedures. Snow contains air pockets that trap heat, she explained, demonstrating the proper packing technique. The Inuit people build entire homes from snow blocks during winter. The material itself isn't warm, but its structure prevents heat from escaping, like the wool in your coat. James considered this information with the seriousness that characterized his approach to learning. So we're using the cold to stay warm? We're using the properties of snow to create an advantage from what appears to be only a challenge, Sarah corrected gently. Most obstacles contain potential resources if we observe carefully enough to identify them. This philosophy, finding utility in circumstances others might see as merely threatening, had guided Sarah through countless crises during the war. Field hospitals regularly lacked essential supplies, requiring creative adaptation of available materials to serve medical needs. What others discarded as useless, Sarah had learned to evaluate for potential alternative functions. Throughout the day, Sarah maintained regular observation of their surroundings despite the limited visibility. The storm provided protection from immediate pursuit, but also created new dangers that required vigilant monitoring. She checked for signs of structural stress on their shelter, accumulation patterns that might indicate upcoming roof collapse, and changes in wind direction that would require ventilation adjustments to prevent smoke buildup inside their refuge. By mid-afternoon, the snowfall had diminished noticeably, though heavy clouds remained. Sarah calculated that approximately 24 inches had accumulated during the storm's peak intensity, with continuing light precipitation likely for several more hours. Wind patterns suggested the system was slowly moving eastward, potentially allowing improved conditions by the following day. This assessment required significant adjustment to their travel timeline. Even with horses, movement through such deep snow would be exhausting and slow. The animals would expend precious energy, breaking trail, while the children would struggle to maintain body temperature during prolonged exposure. "We'll remain here tomorrow as well," Sarah announced after careful consideration of variables. "The snow needs time to settle and compact before we attempt significant travel." Emma, who had developed remarkable insight into her mother's decision-making processes, asked the question the younger children didn't yet know to formulate. "Do we have enough supplies to wait?" Sarah appreciated her daughter's perception while considering how to address the legitimate concern without creating unnecessary anxiety. "We'll implement conservation measures starting now. Smaller portions, careful monitoring of the fire to maximize heat while minimizing wood consumption." This straightforward acknowledgement of their situation's seriousness, without either false reassurance or excessive alarm, reflected Sarah's approach to patient communication during her medical service. Honesty calibrated to understanding capacity had proven more effective than either comforting deception or brutal directness. As darkness approached much earlier than normal due to heavy cloud cover, Sarah organized their evening meal with careful attention to rationing. The portions were smaller than previous days, but prepared with attention to providing maximum sustenance and warmth. Hot broth served before the main allocation enhanced the satisfaction derived from limited resources, another technique developed during supply shortages in field hospitals. "Tell us about the Comanche winter camps, Mama," Rebecca requested as they ate, seeking both information and the comfort of her mother's voice. Sarah selected details appropriate for their current circumstances while providing accurate cultural information that might prove valuable during upcoming interactions. Unlike many eastern tribes that maintained permanent villages, the Comanche move with the seasons, following game and adapting to weather patterns, she explained. During winter, they seek sheltered valleys that provide protection from wind, while remaining close to water sources that won't freeze completely. As she described Comanche winter lodges, teepees positioned to deflect prevailing winds, with interior fire pits that provided remarkable heat efficiency, Sarah consciously built positive anticipation for their destination while reinforcing her children's confidence in finding genuine assistance once they reach Comanche territory. "Their winter clothing is particularly effective," she continued, drawing on observations made during her treatment of Black Hawk. "Multiple layers of buckskin and fur arranged to trap body heat while allowing necessary movement. Some designs are superior to the standard-issue greatcoats provided to Union cavalry during winter campaigns." This respectful description of indigenous technological achievement served dual purposes: educating her children beyond the dismissive prejudices common among white settlers, while preparing them for cultural differences they would soon encounter directly. That night, as snow continued falling lightly outside their shelter, Sarah maintained her vigilant rest pattern while calculating their remaining supplies against estimated travel time to Comanche territory. The situation had become more precarious than she had initially communicated to the children, with their margin for error essentially eliminated by the storm's impact on both travel conditions and time frame. If her estimates proved accurate, reaching, potential assistance would require at least 5 additional days of travel through deep snow, longer than their supplies would last with conventional rationing. The horses provided potential emergency sustenance if necessary, though Sarah considered that absolutely final option given their essential transportation value. More immediate was her concern about Emma, who had developed a slight cough during the evening. Sarah's medical assessment detected no fever or significant respiratory distress, but experience had taught her how quickly travel exposure could develop into more serious conditions, particularly in children, using carefully measured ingredients. From her medical kit, Sarah prepared a tea containing willow bark for its fever-preventing properties and a small amount of preserved horehound to soothe throat irritation. These botanical interventions represented the integration of conventional medical training with traditional remedies she had documented during the war, another example of Sarah's pragmatic approach to utilizing all available resources regardless of their origin. "Drink it while still hot," she instructed Emma, who accepted the bitter concoction without complaint, having learned that her mother's medical preparations were unpleasant but effective. "Small sips, all of it." The night passed with Sarah maintaining heightened attention to Emma's breathing patterns while continuing regular assessment of their shelter's integrity against accumulating snow. By morning, Emma's cough had neither worsened nor improved, a neutral development that Sarah considered cautiously positive given the circumstances. Dawn brought clearing skies for the first time since the storm began, revealing a transformed landscape brilliant with sunlight reflecting off unbroken snow. The temperature had dropped further with the clearing weather, the air carrying the distinctive crystalline quality of deep winter despite the season's early timing. Sarah's first action was thorough assessment of their wider surroundings, now visible with the improved conditions. From a vantage point atop a snow-covered boulder near their shelter, she used her telescope to scan methodically in all directions, confirming they remained alone in this section of wilderness. No signs of their pursuers were visible, supporting her assessment that the survey crew would have sought substantial shelter during the storm, rather than continuing their search. This provided temporary advantage, but not permanent safety. Experienced frontiersmen would resume tracking once conditions permitted, and the snow-covered landscape would preserve any tracks with perfect clarity once they began moving again. Sarah's attention focused particularly westward, their intended direction of travel toward Comanche territory. The unbroken snow stretched toward distant hills that marked the beginning of more significant elevation changes. Those hills represented both challenge and potential sanctuary, as Comanche winter camps typically utilized the sheltered valleys. Between such features, returning to their shelter, Sarah outlined the day's objectives with characteristic clarity. "Today we strengthen ourselves and prepare for travel. Tomorrow at first light, we continue westward regardless of conditions." The forced delay provided opportunity for necessary maintenance of both equipment and physical condition. Sarah implemented a structured program of activities designed to prepare them for the demanding travel ahead while conserving critical resources. The horses required particular attention after extended restriction in their makeshift shelter. Sarah checked each animal thoroughly for signs of leg strain or hoof issues, applying preventative treatments where indicated. Using techniques learned from cavalry veterinarians, she guided the children in exercises designed to maintain the horse's muscle condition despite confinement, leading them in carefully measured circles through the snow, gradually increasing distance as paths became established. For the children themselves, Sarah organized activities that combined practical preparation with sufficient physical movement to maintain health without unnecessary energy expenditure. Emma's cough concerned her most directly, prompting regular administration of the medicinal tea alongside careful monitoring for additional symptoms. "How will we travel through such deep snow?" James asked, as he helped Sarah adjust the horses. "Tack for carrying maximum supplies with minimum discomfort. The horses will break trail in rotation," she explained, demonstrating proper adjustment of girth straps to prevent sores during difficult travel. "We'll ride for shorter periods and walk alongside to maintain our own warmth while preserving the animals' energy." Throughout the day, Sarah continued regular observation of their surroundings while making final modifications to their equipment for improved function in deep snow conditions. Using materials from their limited supplies, she created gaiters for each child, protective coverings that would prevent snow from entering boots during the inevitable periods of walking through drifts. From canvas scraps, Sarah fashioned crude but functional snowshoes for emergency use if they encountered sections too deep for conventional travel. The design reflected principles she had observed among indigenous patients treated during winter campaigns: wider surface area, distributed weight over the snow's crust, rather than breaking through with each step. As evening approached, Sarah conducted final inventory of their supplies, making difficult decisions about what to retain versus what could be sacrificed to lighten their load. Every item was evaluated with ruthless practicality, essential for survival versus merely useful under better circumstances. "We leave at first light," she reminded the children as they settled for sleep in their shelter for the final night. Everything packed and ready before eating. While the children slept, Sarah made her own preparations with methodical thoroughness. The revolver was cleaned and checked, then loaded with careful conservation of their limited ammunition. Maps were reviewed, routes recalculated based on new conditions, and mental contingencies established for various challenges they might encounter. Most critically, Sarah assessed each child's condition with the clinical precision developed through years of medical practice. James showed remarkable resilience, his naturally sturdy constitution adapting well despite the stresses of their journey. Rebecca, though physically smaller, maintained surprising stamina, supported by uncomplaining acceptance of their circumstances. Emma's condition remained Sarah's primary medical concern. The cough had neither worsened dramatically nor resolved completely, existing in the uncertain middle ground between minor irritation and developing illness. Sarah prepared additional willow bark and horehound mixture, carefully measuring their dwindling medicinal supplies to ensure continued treatment options if the condition progressed. By morning, Emma's cough had stabilized with no advancing symptoms. Sufficient for travel, though requiring continued monitoring. The sky remained clear as dawn lightened the eastern horizon, revealing temperatures that had dropped further overnight. The snow had developed a crystalline crust that crunched audibly underfoot, challenging for walking but potentially supportive, enough to improve the horse's movement once warming temperatures softened it slightly. Sarah organized their departure with the focused efficiency that had once orchestrated field hospital relocations during active military operations. Each child received clear responsibility appropriate to their capabilities, creating both functional contribution and maintained sense of purpose during crisis. Emma, secure the packs on the Pinto. James, fill the water containers with fresh snow for melting during midday rest. Rebecca, help me extinguish the fire completely. As they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, Sarah conducted a final survey of the surrounding landscape. The brilliant morning light revealed an environment of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary danger. Pristine white expanses stretching toward distant hills that marked the beginning of Comanche territory. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on Sarah as she helped Rebecca mount behind Emma on the bay gelding. The same community that had considered a widow with 3 children too burdensome to assist was now pursuing them across winter wilderness, apparently valuing Sarah's property above the lives of her family. "We follow the valley floor, where snow will be less deep," Sarah instructed as they began their careful progress. "Conserve energy and watch for changes in the snow's consistency." Leading the pinto mare with James mounted securely, Sarah established their westward course with the precision that had once guided medical supply convoys through unfamiliar territory. Each step was carefully placed, each decision weighed against multiple variables, from animal condition to wind direction to terrain evaluation. By mid-morning, they had established a sustainable rhythm of travel, alternating which horse broke trail through deeper sections while maintaining their general direction toward the distant hills. The sun provided essential warmth despite temperatures that remained well below freezing, creating the paradoxical condition of simultaneously helping and threatening their progress as the snow surface began softening slightly. "Listen," Sarah instructed suddenly, halting their movement with a raised hand. In the distance, barely audible but unmistakable to Sarah's experienced hearing, came the sound that confirmed her earlier concerns, the faint report of a rifle shot, echoing across the snow-covered landscape from the direction they had come. "Are they shooting at us, Mama?" James asked, his voice steady despite the obvious concern in his eyes. "No," Sarah assured him, mentally calculating distance based on acoustic properties. "They're far behind us, likely hunting for food, but it confirms they've resumed pursuit despite the storm." This intelligence required immediate adjustment to their strategy. Sarah had hoped the storm might have convinced the survey crew to abandon their search, but the distant gunshot confirmed at least some pursuers remained committed to their task. "We need to increase our pace," she decided, evaluating the relative condition of children and horses against the new threat assessment. The hills ahead offer both concealment and defensive position. The pace Sarah established pushed against the limits of sustainable travel through deep snow, demanding significant exertion from both horses and humans. She rotated who rode and who walked alongside at regular intervals, ensuring no one experienced extended periods of either too much exertion or dangerous inactivity in the bitter cold. Emma's cough worsened with the increased exertion and cold. Air exposure, becoming more frequent though remaining relatively unproductive, a concerning development that Sarah monitored with professional assessment beneath maternal worry. During their midday stop for water and minimal food, she administered another dose of the medicinal tea, grateful they had maintained sufficient fire capability to heat water despite conservation measures. "The tea tastes worse than yesterday," Emma observed after drinking the mixture. "I increased the horehound concentration," Sarah explained, conducting subtle assessment of her daughter's respiratory status while adjusting Rebecca's boots. "The bitter taste means it's working more effectively." This small deception, suggesting therapeutic value from taste rather than acknowledging their dwindling medicinal supplies, had required dilution with additional bitter elements to maintain. Perceived potency reflected Sarah's careful balance between honesty and necessary reassurance. The psychological aspects of healing had proven as important as physical interventions throughout her medical career. By late afternoon, they had made significant progress toward the distant hills, but Sarah noted with concern how the physical demands were affecting both children and horses. The animals moved with the heavy-legged determination of creatures pushing beyond normal exertion limits, while the children's faces showed the drawn quality of fatigue despite their remarkable endurance. Most concerning was the change in weather developing behind them. Heavy clouds had reappeared on the eastern horizon, advancing steadily westward in a pattern that Sarah recognized from years of frontier weather observation. Another storm system was approaching, potentially more severe than the one they had. Weathered in their temporary shelter, "We need to reach the hills before nightfall," Sarah announced, calculating remaining daylight against distance and travel speed. "The next storm will arrive by morning." This assessment added urgency to their already challenging journey, Sarah reorganized their movement pattern, placing both younger children on the stronger bay gelding, while she led them through the deepest snow sections, physically breaking trail herself to preserve the horses' diminishing energy reserves. The exertion was tremendous, each step requiring Sarah to lift her foot high above the snow's surface before plunging through the crust to find uncertain footing beneath. The process consumed energy at an alarming rate, while generating internal heat that caused perspiration despite the bitter cold, a dangerous combination that could lead to rapid temperature drop once the exertion ended. Sarah monitored her own condition with the same clinical detachment she applied to assessing patients, recognizing early indicators of approaching exhaustion, but calculating sufficient reserves to reach the hills before collapse became inevitable. Years of pushing physical limits during crisis situations had taught her precisely how far human endurance could extend when necessity demanded. As the sun approached the western horizon, they finally reached the first significant elevation changes that marked the beginning of the hill country. Sarah selected their approach carefully, identifying a narrow valley between two higher ridges that offered both shelter from wind and defensive visibility of any approach from the east. "We'll establish position here for the night," she decided, selecting a location that combined natural windbreak features with proximity to a stand of pines that would provide both firewood and additional shelter construction materials. The campsite Sarah chose reflected her tactical training rather than merely wilderness survival knowledge. The position provided clear observation of the valley they had traversed while remaining difficult to detect from below. Multiple exit routes existed if retreat became necessary, while the terrain naturally channeled any approach into predictable paths that could be more easily monitored despite limited visibility. As darkness descended, Sarah efficiently established their camp with the silent cooperation of exhausted children who nonetheless performed their assigned tasks without complaint. The shelter she constructed was more rudimentary than their previous, when focusing on essential wind protection and heat retention rather than comfort considerations. "Smaller portions tonight," she reminded them as she prepared their evening meal, the rationing necessitated by both dwindling supplies and recognition of approaching storm conditions that might prevent travel for another full day. "Eat slowly to feel more satisfied." While the children huddled near the small fire, Sarah maintained regular observation of their back trail despite the failing light. The distant pursuers had not appeared within visual range during daylight hours, but her military experience had taught her that tactical approach often accelerated during transition to darkness, when quarry typically established fixed positions. As she had anticipated, the clouds continued advancing from the east, gradually obscuring the stars that had briefly appeared after sunset. The temperature dropped further with nightfall, the cold intensifying to the point where exposed skin developed burning sensation within minutes. Inside their shelter, Sarah organized sleeping arrangements to maximize shared body heat while maintaining her access to defensive positions if necessary. The revolver remained within immediate reach as always, though she calculated ammunition use carefully against potential threats. Their bullets represented both defense capability and emergency hunting potential if food supplies diminished entirely. As the children drifted into exhausted sleep, Sarah maintained her vigilance despite her own significant fatigue. The pursuer's gunshot from earlier in the day confirmed what her military experience had already suggested. The survey crew's interest in recovering their horses and possibly enforcing the banker's apparent claim to her property had evolved into determination that surpassed normal commercial motivation. Something beyond mere property recovery drove their continued pursuit through dangerous winter conditions. Sarah suspected connections between the banker, the railroad interests, and perhaps municipal authorities in Clearwater might reveal motivations more complex than simple financial considerations, possibly extending to knowledge of mineral deposits or other valuable resources on land she legally owned. These considerations, while academically interesting, remained secondary to immediate survival requirements. The approaching storm, Emma's developing respiratory concerns, and their dwindling supplies created challenges that would tax even Sarah's extraordinary capabilities. Yet as she watched her sleeping children, Sarah felt the same resolute determination that had carried her through battlefield hospitals where others surrendered to despair. They would survive this journey. They would reach Comanche territory. They would find Black Hawk or his people, the people of Clearwater who had so carelessly abandoned them to winter's mercy, would never comprehend the magnitude of their miscalculation. In dismissing a seeming widow with 3 small children, they had instead unleashed a woman whose experiences had forged exceptional capabilities, whose determination acknowledged no conventional limitations when protecting those under her care. As the first snowflakes of the new storm began falling outside their shelter, Sarah adjusted the blankets around her children and prepared herself for the challenges of the coming day. The journey had become a crucible that would test every skill and resource she possessed, but failure simply wasn't an option she would consider. Sarah reluctantly agreed to rest, settling into a chair positioned to allow immediate response if needed. Within moments, exhaustion claimed her despite her trained vigilance, the cumulative toll of their journey finally overwhelming even her exceptional endurance. She awakened to soft dawn light, filtering through the cabin's small windows. Emma's condition had improved noticeably overnight. The fierce fever had diminished, and her breathing showed significant easing of the labored quality that had caused such concern. Mary had maintained faithful watch, administering treatments at regular intervals throughout the night with the disciplined consistency of a seasoned healer. "The medicine works," Mary stated simply, acknowledging Sarah's immediate assessment of her daughter. She fought strongly through the night. Before Sarah could respond, the cabin door opened to admit 2 Rivers, his expression carrying both urgency and controlled purpose. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported without preamble, 4 men moving with purpose rather than caution. Sarah rose immediately, years of crisis response displacing any remnants of sleep. "Sheriff Benton and his men," she confirmed, mentally calculating options with practiced efficiency. 2 Rivers nodded once. "They'll reach the cabin within 30 minutes. We must decide how to address them." This direct approach to threat assessment matched Sarah's own preference for clarity during crisis. She glanced at her children. Emma still recovering, but significantly improved. James and Rebecca just beginning to stir from sleep. "These men have demonstrated willingness to pursue a mother and children through winter storms," Sarah stated, the implication clear regarding their likely intentions. "I see no reason to expect reasonable discussion." 2 Rivers' expression showed agreement with this assessment. "I've seen such men before. They serve interests beyond law, using authority as shield for taking what others possess. What do you propose?" Sarah asked, recognizing that options existed beyond her initial calculations. 2 Rivers moved to a small trunk positioned near the cabin's rear wall. From within, he withdrew several folded documents bearing official seals and signatures. "Treaties exist defining territorial boundaries," he explained, placing the papers on the table. "This cabin stands precisely 3 miles inside the boundary established by the Henderson Agreement of 1869. Sarah immediately grasped the strategic significance. "Territorial officials have no jurisdiction here." "Precisely," 2 Rivers confirmed. "Sheriff Benton holds no authority here under territorial law. More importantly, the treaty explicitly prohibits armed territorial representatives from entering without official tribal council permission." This information represented unexpected legal advantage, bureaucratic boundaries creating protection through jurisdictional technicality rather than direct confrontation. Sarah recognized the sophisticated strategy behind Two Rivers' apparently isolated settlement location. Will they honor such boundaries? She questioned practically. Two Rivers' expression showed grim understanding of frontier realities. They may not, but violations of treaty boundaries become federal matters requiring investigation by Indian agents and army representatives, complications beyond a local sheriff's ability to dismiss. As they discussed strategy, Mary had already begun preparations, moving the children to the cabin's rear room while gathering specific items that suggested planned response rather than improvised reaction. Sarah noted these activities with professional assessment of their implications. "You've addressed similar situations before," she observed. Two Rivers nodded once, confirming her deduction. "Railroad interests have repeatedly attempted to establish survey lines through this valley despite treaty boundaries. Creating documented violations serves multiple purposes." Before further discussion could occur, the distinctive sound of approaching horsemen reached them through the morning stillness. Two Rivers moved to position himself at the cabin's front window, maintaining visual observation while remaining largely concealed from outside view. "They've stopped at the property boundary," he reported, discussing among themselves. Sarah joined him at the window, careful to remain out of direct sightline. Through a small gap in the curtain, she observed Sheriff Benton and 3 men she recognized from the survey crew, their expressions showing the determined calculation of those prepared for potential conflict rather than mere recovery of property. "How do you wish to proceed?" Two Rivers asked, respecting Sarah's agency in addressing her pursuers despite his territorial advantage. Sarah considered options with the strategic assessment developed through years of crisis management during war. Direct confrontation presented unnecessary risks, while legal technicalities alone might prove insufficient against determined adversaries. Willing to ignore such boundaries. Documents first, she decided, pragmatic approach, prioritizing potential resolution without escalation. Force remains available if necessary. Two Rivers nodded approval of this measured approach, reaching for a rifle positioned near the door, not raising it immediately, but ensuring availability if circumstances required. Mary had already moved to a position where she could monitor the children while maintaining access to what appeared to be a shotgun partially concealed behind household items. The family's prepared defensive positioning reflected systematic security. Planning rather than reactive fear, another indicator of previous experience with similar confrontations. Sarah appreciated this readiness without requiring explicit discussion. When Sheriff Benton finally approached the cabin, his stance revealed both uncertainty and determination. The treaty boundary marker he had passed was clearly visible. Carved stone post bearing official designation, suggesting awareness of its significance while demonstrating willingness to ignore such technicalities. "Mitchell woman," he called, remaining mounted rather than approaching the door directly. "We know you're in there. Come out and face territorial justice for theft and endangering children." The irony of the accusation wasn't lost on Sarah, who had fled precisely to protect her children from the dangers Clearwater's officials had created through their callous abandonment. Two Rivers glanced at her, silently questioning whether she wished to respond directly or have him address the intruders. "I'll speak," Sarah decided, moving toward the door with deliberate calm. "But maintain readiness." Stepping onto the cabin's porch with precise control of her positioning, visible to Benton while remaining partially protected by structural elements, Sarah addressed her pursuers with the composed authority that had once commanded medical units under artillery fire. "Sheriff Benton," she acknowledged without warmth, "you've crossed a treaty boundary clearly marked by federal authority. Your jurisdiction ended 3 miles east of this property. Benton's expression revealed momentary uncertainty before hardening into renewed determination. Don't attempt legal trickery, Mrs. Mitchell. You've stolen property and fled lawful authority. Surrender yourself and return to Clearwater for proper adjudication. The horses were necessary for survival after Clearwater's. Council abandoned 3 children to winter conditions, Sarah countered evenly. As for jurisdiction, I suggest you examine the Henderson Treaty before making claims that may constitute federal violations. As she spoke, 2 Rivers emerged to stand beside her, treaty documents visible in his hand while rifle remained available. At his side, the sheriff's eyes widened slightly at this development, clearly recognizing 2 Rivers despite apparent surprise at his presence. This situation has drawn attention beyond your anticipation, Sheriff, 2 Rivers stated with formal precision. Representatives from Black Hawk's band have been notified of treaty violation. Federal Indian agents at Fort Carlson will receive documentation by week's end. This coordinated presentation of legal complication beyond local control created visible impact on Benton's calculation. The mention of federal authorities who might question motivations behind pursuing a widow and children through winter storms clearly initiated reassessment of his position. The standoff continued for several tense moments before Benton finally nodded curtly, not surrendering, but acknowledging tactical stalemate. "This isn't finished, Mitchell," he stated, attempting to maintain authority despite effective checkmate. "The bank's claim remains valid." "As does my deed," Sarah responded steadily. "Perhaps railroad interests should negotiate directly rather than employing questionable enforcement through local officials. Such matters might interest territorial newspapers." The implied threat of public exposure created final leverage against continued pursuit. Benton and his men departed with minimal additional confrontation, their retreat representing not moral surrender, but practical recognition of complications beyond their capacity to address. As Sarah watched them cross the boundary marker heading eastward, 2 Rivers stood beside her in companionable silence, the quiet understanding of those who had navigated complex frontier conflicts where justice rarely emerged from official channels alone. "They'll return eventually," he noted pragmatically, "but through different approaches, legal challenges rather than direct pursuit." "By then we'll have established countermeasures," Sarah replied with quiet determination. "And documented both." Clearwater's abandonment of children during winter and the bank's coordinated efforts to seize legally owned property. 2 Rivers nodded approval of this strategic thinking. "You're welcome to remain until such preparations are complete. Black Hawk's representatives will arrive once weather permits mountain passage." The invitation represented not merely temporary shelter, but potential alliance, connection to resources and protection beyond what Sarah could establish independently. The bone amulet had indeed fulfilled Black Hawk's promise of assistance, though through unexpected channels. Inside the cabin, Emma's condition continued improving under Mary's careful treatment. The immediate danger had passed. Both medical emergency and pursuing threat addressed through combination of traditional knowledge and strategic thinking that transcended conventional boundaries. Sarah Mitchell had been gravely underestimated by those who saw merely a widow with children. In dismissing her as vulnerable and exploitable, they had failed to recognize the exceptional woman whose experiences had forged remarkable capabilities, whose determination acknowledged no conventional limitations when protecting those under her care. The people of Clearwater would eventually understand the profound miscalculation they had made. The widow they had abandoned to winter's mercy had found not just survival, but powerful alliance, her journey revealing connections and capabilities beyond their limited imagination. As Sarah closed the cabin door against the bitter morning cold, She felt something that had eluded her since the fire claimed their home and Thomas's life, not merely momentary safety, but genuine path forward. The future remained challenging, but no longer navigated alone. If this story of courage against impossible odds touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of extraordinary people facing overwhelming challenges. Let us know in the comments which part of Sarah's journey resonated most with you, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful story of resilience and determination. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable narratives to life.